very nice to be here. Australia. What an amazing place. Extraordinary inspiration. The last big piece I made was in Western Australia, on the Yilgarn Craton. A unique piece of rock, the size of a continent. It's basically about 1/2 of the whole of Western Australia, that formed between 3.9 and 2.5 billion years ago. And I think that what Australia offers me as an artist is an opportunity to put things in context. I think that it's amazing to be here now at the time of the Biennale. I think that Australia has an enormous cultural job to do. You could be the cultural leaders of the entire Pacific. And maybe at a time when government has really become business, is it possible for art to be a focus for those really big issues to do with identity, to do with human futures, and whether or not, if there is 6 billion years left in the generating capacity of the greatest nuclear reactor that we have, which is in the sun, we have to decide whether the human project is going to participate in the further evolution of life forms on this planet. I think that in some curious way, Australia wants to, its wealth coming from, in a way, primary extraction industries, wants to turn its back on the biggest challenge facing this species, which is our anthropic influence on climate. I'm not trying to underscore anything that I say today with a monofilament political argument. But I think we have to realize that if we can detach art from that surplus production position of individual objects of high worth that exchange hands for high prices, and open it up as a site of confrontation, participation, experimentation. Perhaps art can become an arena where possible human futures can be debated and envisioned. The real issue is, can our core beliefs change? Can human nature change in facing its nature within nature as a whole? It's interesting, I've been sort of batting on about this very same issue since I was here in 1989, and I may have even used the same kind of terminology, but I think in the distance, in those 20 years between 1989 and now, the issue is much more acute. So this issue of what art is, what have you all come here for? Have you come to be entertained or to participate? What do we think of the space of art being? Is it a place where we are comforted or challenged? Is it a place where, in some senses, we relax into the assurance of our position in the world, or one in which we are disorientated? Well, I would obviously take the latter in both cases. We have moved from the time of magical thinking. We no longer make icons either of beatific joy based often on idealized female sexuality, or icons of transcendent suffering that promises release in a further life. We only have one life, we've only got one planet. So, you might say, well, this is a bit of a heavy burden to place on art. Art, after all, is in a sense an extra activity. I don't believe that. It's time for art to come out of the specialized ghetto, or in fact, that whole place that it's been pushed, which in many senses is institutionalized. You could say that a building like this in some senses is a hospital. It's a place where, in a way, works that have had a life, have had a context, have had a home within an ideological and belief system, come to rest as memories of a former life. Can art get out of this specialized ghetto, its ghetto of specialization, and begin to take up that place that it always had prior to the 18th century, of being a central focus for life? We are out of the 20th century characterized by this succession of isms in which art inquired into its own nature. I think that now is the time when art has to give back to you, give back to us, the freedoms that it took for itself, the freedoms of self-determination. But that means that you have work to do. We all have work to do. What Gombrich called the beholder's share, what Duchamp called the 50% that the viewer has to do in a non-retinal phase of art, that I think we would all agree we're in. We have left the perceptual, the illustrative, the making of pictures, and we're now in a phase in which the proposition of art, the material proposition of art, is one that demands an absolute participation, and you are the subject within it. Okay, enough of a preamble. Now you are going to be entertained a bit. I'm going to show some pictures. Oh, has that been there all the time? Yep. Oh dear, that was supposed to be a kind of, relief moment. But there it is. So this is a small part of a work called Event Horizon. Event Horizon, comes from cosmological physics. It's primarily used for the condition within a black hole where objects no longer become visible because the light that they might reflect is sucked. But it also refers to the rather wonderful thought experiment that actually there are luminous bodies within the universe, that because the universe is expanding, their light, even though it's traveling at the speed of light, will never reach us. So, what's that got to do with this? It's a good question. We have minds that live in bodies. We have bodies that live in rooms. Rooms live in buildings. Buildings gather together to form cities that dwell in a land. Now that 50% of us live within the city, within, in a way, the realization of Mondrian's urban grid, we spend most of our time, in some senses, dealing with a built environment, dealing with a made world. Now, the idea of this installation is to undermine that. We are left on the street, in the chasm, between high-rise. If Australia is a certain kind of test site for a realization about geology and geological time, New York could be conceived of as a test site for high-density, high-rise, human urban living. But when you are immersed within this matrix, you don't see the horizon. So these bodies that have been, as it were, taken out of the normal condition of shelter and enclosure within the building and are looking out towards a horizon that we can't see, are in a way asking this very simple, same question that I think my work has asked from the very beginning. Where does the human being fit in the scheme of things? Now, if we're living at a time where most of us are spending most of our time dealing with meta-languages, dealing with, in a way, hermeneutics, dealing with the way in which experience is translated through image and text into a secondary and communicatable symbolic language. And if we are immersed, as we are, within an urban frame, that means that for most of us, in lives loaded with obligation, are dealing entirely with, as it were, made culture. Material culture is what human beings made in order to allow themselves to survive. But now we seem to be dealing more with that, is a way, immediate material culture than we are with, as it were, the elemental world that surrounds it. So what I'm asking, to go back to my first comments, is whether we can go back to that, you could say, primitive. We don't use that word anymore for very good reasons. That from, the savage mind onwards, and incredibly because of the work of Marcel Mauss, Evans Pritchard, Malinowski, many others, we understand the complexity and beauty of, in a way, those intelligences that were never encased within the urban grid. And we learnt about them maybe too late. But what art was for the pre-literate society was a certainty of survival. Maybe not personal survival, because that didn't matter, but the survival of the, in a way, the central myths and the continuity of the way of being, whether that's architecture, body painting, dance, the stories people told. Now, this may be very, very strange to show you this slide, but this is the return of that repressed, so far as I'm concerned. This is the body that modernism excluded, returned to the site of boogie-woogie, and looking out, in a way, reminding perhaps these urban dwellers of the kinds of functions that the Maui of Rapa Nui do. They look out beyond the immediate to a far horizon. If our minds inhabit our bodies and our bodies inhabit architecture, in some senses we are one skin inside another. The final skin is a horizon. The final skin is, in a way, the perceptual limit of human consciousness. Art is always testing that limit and trying to leap over it. And I think that's a really important thing. When so many of us are so concentrated on, in a way, issues of immediate profit or issues of immediate comfort, the ability of art to coexist within our world and give it a dimension of imagination, reverie, self-reflexiveness, strangeness, is terribly critical. This is Larbi Cherkawi, Sidi Larbi Cherkawi. This is a dance piece that I was lucky enough to collaborate with. This is Sidi in one of the 17 boxes. what's he doing? This was made with 16 monks from Shaolin. But what's the point? The point here is I'm trying to talk about the second body. I'm trying to set up an equivalence or an equation between the first and the second body. The idea of consciousness within physical form within the context of this strange environment that we've invented for ourselves. We're the only species on this planet that chooses to live within this degree of abstract geometry. And yeah, for me, testing the limits, what is it? If architecture is a form of manifested philosophy, if we are, as it were, living within this as our primary context, what effect does it have on our minds, our bodies, our affective life? It's always been necessary for me to test that, to test the skin, the clothes, the room, the city, and try to render something that, in my childhood, I was brought up in the 50s, everything was fixed, and nothing, in a way, was clean enough, good enough. But there were rules. And you couldn't change anything. You couldn't ask questions. There was a sense in which everything was a given and it was decided by others. I think that from very early on, I had an idea that wasn't right, that somehow the notion of inherited structures that were themselves very conformist and that made you conform had to be questioned, had to be resisted. This was an early and rather surreal attempt. This is a later and rather more, you could say, what is the right word? Melancholy is in there. It's monumental but pathetic. It is, I don't know if you could read it, but it's a human form. It's a human form in the most compressed and resistant position, fetal you might call it. But it carries the form of the city. So this is a 27-ton object, and it's called Space Station, and it rests slightly on the world. It just has 3 points where it just sits stable. There's a core space that you can enter through to go in underneath this elbow. So this is another way of meditating upon and thinking about our collective and subjective condition now. And this is a later attempt. I'm not going to show you Firmament 4, which is in Anna's gallery. We're kind of in it and out of it at the same time. This is another way in which somehow the given conditions of a space, called white cube, so consciously giving you the context of late modernism and the necessary conditions of neutrality for art to become visible to us and to be known as art. We all know about Julius II's tomb, so if you can think about the slaves, if you can think about that idea of, in a sense, a block, but in this case it's not material, this is a spatial block that is being tested by a three-dimensional drawing. It's no longer struggling, but it is simply feeling the edges of a given architectural space. It helps that it's a basement. It helps that the section of this drawing is of a certain and quite light section size. Neither of these works, Space Station nor Firmament, in some senses is simply an object in space. It invites a kind of participation. You can walk underneath, you can walk all around the gallery, and many people didn't know quite what they were coming into. It took a while for them to resolve, as it were, the form. The form itself is here made out of a nesting polyhedral geometry, the same that you'll find at Anna's gallery. Scale. Scale is a very important tool for allowing for reflexivity. If we believe in the viewer's share, if we believe in the beholder's share, then in some senses the rendering porous and making a body into a space can be helped by using scale. And in this interdependence between a given, the human body and its scale, and the given, a human-built architecture and its scale, are presented, I think, the two central subjects. And I don't care what you say about it, but I think that there are only two subjects, and one is the body and the other is space. And the easiest way that space is, as it were, articulated is through architecture. So let's just go back to the beginning. This is something that I made very, very quickly after coming back from India in 1974, where I'd been for 3 years. This is a kind of memory of those extraordinary sights in the early morning in railway stations, on sidewalks, of people sleeping, sometimes with a pair of slippers parked close to the head, or even a transistor radio. The definition in public space, in collective space, of the position of an individual, abstracted, made into a kind of intimate architecture. I think of this as the sort of the first and completely unconscious statement of my project. And the idea of these bodies as, in a way, without a home. And that notion of the homelessness of the body in art, or certainly in sculpture, in a sense post-Rodin, I'm very aware that the taboo, certainly when I started, against any form of figuration. It was seen rather like Baudelaire's commentary about the Salon des Indépendants, the idea that sculpture was the Carib art. In some way it was too primitive. And certainly the biblical prohibition of the making of the graven image linked with the Greenbergian kind of neo-Puritanism of minimalism, and suggested this was something untenable, atavistic, primal. And for me, this moment was an attempt to start again, not from Rodin, starting with the idea of the body as a place rather than a thing, somewhere not to be idealized, to be sexualized, to be heroized, but simply to be focused on, but from the inside. If we all just do this experiment, I like to do this, but if you've been to a lecture of mine before, this may be familiar territory. But if we just close our eyes for a moment, where are we now? We are collectively in a space that is both defined by our bodies and actually allowed by our bodies. You can hear me talking, you may be aware of light. But in some senses, the edges and defining condition of being a body is somehow loosed. Let's open them again. Now, I'm very aware that me standing here on a stage, my appearance, my face, my gestures, my movement, in a sense, belongs to you. I am speaking to you from the other side of my appearance. Equally, when I look at each of you, I can't see you very well, but your appearance, in a sense, belongs more to me than it does to you. How do we begin to articulate this truth? That we all live, as it were, inside our bodies, despite our bodies. We call them my body. But that's just a convenience. We know very well that the body doesn't belong to us, that it's a temporary aggregation of carbon-based molecules that, due to the second law of thermodynamics, can exchange from material to energy. And we have a temporary occupation of this aggregation. But we live within it. What an extraordinary thing. What an extraordinary thing. The Tibetans call it precious human life. We only get one chance. So, how do you begin to rethink the purpose of sculpture with that realization that the body is more a place that we're temporary occupants of, rather than simply a carrier of notions of heroism, maybe portraits of the great and the good? Well, I've leapt a bit, but this is my answer. I've got a body, why make another one? I've got a body, furthermore, that I live within. So this is my primary experience of matter. How do we begin to acknowledge that we are, in Benjamin's terms, in a time of mechanical reproduction? How can I use this realization of the indwelling of a temporary lodging, the body, in the most direct way possible? Well, I have to be the material, the subject, the tool. And this is the result. So here is an indexical, three-dimensional reproduction, you could say, reproduction of my body. And you can see within it everything that pertains to the ontology or story of its making. These four buttons that are used to get the metal in and out. You can see these division lines in the sand mold. You can even see the cling film that covered me while being molded. So what is this process? This, for me, is the core of the work. It is, in a way, the empirical, evidential truth claim of the work. That each piece comes from a lived moment in real time of a real body. And this ontology is just as important as, say, the great 1952 paintings of Pollock. The idea that you don't have to illustrate anything. The point of origin of a work of art is its own myth, and that you can share that place of origin with everyone.